Welcome back. Welcome back to Scale Without Chaos. I'm Samantha Reel, your host, and I'm thrilled to introduce Greg Dorban, the CEO of Comfy Workers. And I'm going to let Greg go into his own description of him and his company and what he does. But Greg, I just want to say thank you so much for making the time. I know we are on very different time zones with you being in the UK this week and me being here in the United States. So much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So first, why don't you go into just a quick overview of who you are, what Comfy Workers and then we'll dive right in and talk about the real reason why I really wanted to invite you here on this podcast.
Brilliant. Sounds great, Samantha. So I'm a probably serial founder, entrepreneur, always been interested in businesses. My professional background comes from marketing leadership roles in an agency, B2B agency. Spent over a decade there leading strategy for US blue chip clients, global corporates, some scale ups, some startups, but primarily was focused around how to drive demand and revenue before demand generation and revenue agencies were a thing in the marketing world. Recently been a CEO of a VC funded HR recruitment software. And now I'm full-time CEO of Comfy Workers, which we started during COVID. It's been sort of incubated for the past couple of years, and now it's ready for full-time leadership and to put the foot down on it. So that's been the past few years. What we do as a company, we are basically a B2B accommodation provider. We operate as a marketplace. So we're comparable to someone like Airbnb, obviously not at that scale, but we sell exclusively to businesses, primarily construction firms. They're our ICP, ideal clients, but we also sell into a load of adjacent or alternative like companies, vet practices, ship crews, anyone that's really business team focused rather than an individual worker that might be transient and need a hotel for a couple of days. So teams, mid to long-term duration, and complexity of logistics around the booking.
Very cool. Very interesting. And one that I have a personal connection with my husband being a foreman for I won't mention, but very large construction company in the utility space. So I know firsthand what you do and how important it is. And I can't wait to introduce you when you come to the United States with your products. So very excited.
Sounds good.
So let's set the scene just a little bit. So I've done some research into Comfy Workers and really the origin story of it. And I thought one thing was really interesting. So you talk about the biggest wins coming from fixing problems that people ignore. So how is this something that people ignore, and how did you land on workforce accommodation?
So my wife has a parallel company. We call it a sister company, but she's been an Airbnb host for 6 or 7 years now, so pre-COVID. And where the inception of Comfy Workers came from was during lockdown. So in the UK, we had 3 lockdowns. And during lockdown, a lot of her guests that were staying at the time were key workers, construction firms, building warehouses, road infrastructure. And then when lockdown happened, they obviously stayed and continued to work. And what happened is when they finished the work in Bedford, which is where we live and where we operated at the time, they were, I'm moving to Birmingham, I'm moving to Coventry. Do you have houses there? Which at the time we didn't. And as part of that, then it was, well, can we find someone that has a house there? Because they're going to be crying out for guests because Airbnb's closed, Booking.com's closed.
Yeah.
Like they need to attract key workers. So we went through all of our personal networks and then went to Facebook and started doing outreach to try and find accommodation providers to be able to say, hey, we have someone, they need 3 months, there's 6 guys, can you accommodate them? And basically like manually facilitated these bookings. But we did that for 3 months, 6 months. And then it got to the point where when lockdown lifted, it was unbelievably distracting for the team. Because they're like, well, what am I trying to do? Am I managing the landlords that we manage for, or she manages for? Am I managing your properties? Or am I actually like looking after these guests wherever they go in the UK? And all of them are different business models and all of them different workflows. And it was like, this just isn't going to work. So we either said we stop doing this and stop looking after the customers wherever they travel in the UK, or we break it out and it becomes a separate company.
Mm,
So we broke it out. It became a separate company, came company workers, the staff sort of were separate. And then but then I basically went into building mode, left my, let's say, corporate role, started a little skunk works building up in the background, and then got to the point with like, okay, we now have a proof of concept
right?
and an MVP we can bring to market after 3 to 6 months. Um, and that's basically how it started.
That's amazing. Like I was telling you, so I do this for my husband by himself. So I will call up Airbnb specifically and say right now, hey, I have a crew of 6 guys. They're coming. They're going to be there for a month. We think they're going to be there for a month. And how can we work with you? And like I said, nothing like that exists. It's crazy how you found a really good niche there.
Yeah, and that's the part of people walking it past it every day. Let's say is people believe the problem is solved because
Mm,
everyone books accommodation when they go on holiday, right? Everyone knows how to book a hotel or book a service department of some sort, and they'll know to go to one of the 3 or 4 main platforms online. They'll go to Google and then type something in, whatever comes up, they'll look at a few options they'll be able to book. So it feels very intuitive and easy. But the challenge is if you do it every week or you have nuances around, well, actually, I need somewhere secure because a van needs to park, or maybe it's a big vehicle,
right.
or actually I've got 6 people, then it goes to 12,
Right.
then I've got another 10 arriving, then some leave, and we've got changeovers. As soon as you start adding in a bit more volume, it becomes not so easily solvable through the normal leisure booking platforms. And again, hotel chains are geared up for this. Hotel chains can easily like handle people coming and going
Right.
and variation. But no one wants to stay in a hotel for 4 weeks, especially not 12 months, but like even 4 weeks, it gets quite tough when you've got a team of 6 people working. So it's really about how do we have something fit for purpose. And that's where most people, I think, walk past it.
Mhm.
Um, and I do think it's a hard problem to solve because we're trying to create a marketplace around this, but because of the booking volume and value, it can't be fully digitized.
Right.
It's not something where the people booking are like, as your example, Samantha, you don't want a situation where it's like, even if you could solve it online, if you're booking somewhere for 6 months, you're probably going to want to check some information.
Correct.
And that means having some element of relationship in B2B, some element of like service as a wrapper around it,
Mhm.
which again just makes it where you can't be a pure digital play. And if you're going to solve it all with relationship and person interaction, then you're going to be really, really inefficient. It's going to be really, really hard to manage. So you sort of have to like blend quite a few worlds, elements of SaaS, elements of marketplace, element of like service business, elements of travel agency. It's like a really interesting melting pot that, well, I find really enjoyable, but it also, I think a lot of people overlook the nuances when you get into how to actually begin to build something that could scale around this.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a really good segue into the 2 that led me to contact you in the first place. So I'll introduce this by just saying that that's a big number, obviously. That's a big number. And what made me reach out to you after reading your LinkedIn post. So anyone who's listening to the podcast right now, Greg has that LinkedIn post. It's gotten quite a bit of traction because it's so honest, right? You're losing 250,000 pounds because of a form,
Painful.
right? So everyone wants to read those kinds of stories. What's happening there where that would cause you to lose 250,000 pounds? So can you talk to me a little bit about that particular instance and what you learned?
Yep. Yeah. And it touches upon what we were just talking about, Samantha, where the trying to build something that's standardized, systemized, ready to scale, you want to keep things as normalized and standard as possible. Everyone operates in the same way because otherwise it's really hard for you to be able to scale your business. The challenge is when you deal with companies larger than
Mhm.
yourself, they have their own standard ways of doing things. And they're not going to bend their processes, especially in a business. And this is where the B2B element really comes in. They're not going to evolve their processes much, to be honest, if any, to be able to operate with you. And by having a way that we basically confirm an order, so we call it a confirmed booking, but it's basically like an order form.
Mhm.
Us having to have it in a certain way where we're compliant with certain legislations, but also protect our hosts and our suppliers, give the company the right level of due diligence
Right.
and protection on the terms. Also, us as a business, we can't be operating with different terms with all the companies we work with. And it basically got to a booking where everyone was happy. Suppliers were happy on the supply side of the marketplace. The customer was happy on the buy side of the marketplace. But we were at a contractual standpoint because, well, look, we can't facilitate this booking unless you complete this form, unless you sign up to these terms, because that's how we get paid and that's how we pay our suppliers.
Mhm.
And they just weren't able to do it. And then we ended up getting into some deeper negotiation and eventually got to a point where they are a customer now,
Right.
but that opportunity we weren't able to win purely based on they wouldn't be able to complete the form and we weren't able to facilitate a booking without the form completed.
There are so many nuances in B2B, and that's one of the reasons why I was so passionate about starting this podcast, because when you take B2B as a huge industry, obviously there's so many subsets. There's no way that you could possibly dig into the details of all of them, right? And you've hit on a very interesting use case, which is counterintuitive to what I would say is the majority of B2B, which is make things as simple as possible, make things as streamlined and as easy as possible. But what you're saying here in this particular instance is no, our audience that we actually needed to be able to complete these bookings needed it to be more complicated. They needed it to be able to fit their current system in order for us to do that. So on the front side, yeah, customers are happy because it's easy, right? That's one audience, but how many times are people missing these other audiences that are part of this closing process and they're thinking that simple is better, but in reality, it's not.
And I think this is the difference between building a SaaS company or a marketplace or anything that's online that could scale.
Right,
Because if I was in a service world, which I've been in, I would just say it's fine.
right,
We negotiate the terms,
right.
we sign some slightly different terms, and we make this deal work.
Mhm.
We do the deal. Easy to do business with, reduce friction. There's really not a problem here.
Absolutely.
But the challenge is by doing that, it would totally change the fundamental nature of what our business is.
Right,
And I know a lot of people
right.
would be looking at this if they're entrepreneurs, founders. Like we do that, all of a sudden we have a different definition, we have a different taxation treatment, we have a different commercial.
Yeah.
It's like, where does that end? And we just can't open that door
Mhm,
for one booking. And at this stage of like the company, so
mhm.
then you reverse engineer. Well, actually, how do we need to give them the guardrails and protections they need, but in a way that keeps us being compliant? And in a lot of these instances, the simplicity eventually comes out of working through the complexity.
Mhm.
It's like you have to go deep, you have to feel the pain, you have to know the nuances to then be like, oh look, here's a really easy option. It's A or B. You can pick now. It's really simple. But to get to the point of knowing there's an A and B, you probably had an A, then you probably had an A, B, C, D, E, F, and then you're like, actually, we can probably get down to just an A and B.
Right.
But you have to go through that process because until you're interacting with customers, until you're on the front line, until you have that real world feedback, you either think what you've got is great or you don't really know what it could be because you haven't faced any of the problems and no one hits it off the bat with no problems. You have to have that feedback to be able to get there eventually. So it's one of those things where I think people look for simplicity on day
Right.
one and then they realize there is loads of nuance around
Right.
things. And then they realize, okay, how do I start to standardize some of the nuance into structures and frameworks and options that then become simple again? But it's going through the, I guess, levels of competence, just like when you learn something.
You just summarized all of the nuances of what I want to achieve with the Scale Without Chaos podcast in one simple use case. That's exactly it.
Well, good luck,
It's
Samantha.
I know, maybe we'll get there. Maybe, but I know I've said this to you before, but I just feel there are so many leaders and founders who are working harder than they need to be because they're not taking the time. They're scaling. They're trying to scale and scale quickly. And just take it for granted that firefighting comes along with that. as opposed to creating those systems and creating those processes that you just talked about that make their lives easier. And it all comes down to people, processes, and systems. I'll probably end up talking about that more later, but that's exactly it. And so how did you go from, okay, we have this problem. How did you get close enough to solution that? What was that? What did that look like? What did that journey look like for you?
As a company, we probably have two ways this happens. Um, the first one is something goes severely wrong, and severe is like it's not really severe, but like it's a meaningful story, right? It's a
Right.
learning moment we can refer back to, and we've got them every year where we've got Derby Gate, we've got scenarios where it's like something went wrong and everyone can learn from this. There's no fault, there's no blame. Everyone could have acted differently. Everyone could have probably acted a bit better, but if one person had done something different, still probably wouldn't have fixed it. It's like it's a systematic problem with how we're working.
Right.
And like one example I can give to make it really real is we had this is month 6 probably, year number
Mm.
1, scrapping for any revenue we could get.
Yes.
And we we confirmed a booking with a supplier that wasn't registered properly on our system.
Uh-huh.
And it was like, well, we can still do the booking, but it's like they were being a bit difficult. We didn't have certain things being like mandatory workflows at the time. And
Mhm.
everyone, I know people are going to listen. You must have everything mandatory when someone signs up. When it's like, well, they're a provider and they've got a house and we can give them the booking. Anyway, to cut the story short, they took the booking. The customer wasn't the actual customer. They were booking it for a subcontractor.
Mhm.
The subcontractor got fired from the job. When they got fired from the job, they damaged the house. And then the host wouldn't refund any of the money because they're like, well, there's damages and um, they've left without notice. And then
Mhm.
the customer's going, well, can I get a refund for what I haven't stayed and I'll pay the damages? Because we didn't have like the right protections in place for everyone, we resolved it amicably, but it took like 3 weeks.
Mhm.
And the customer was like, well, if I'd known on day one, I would have been able to deduct that pay from the supplier
Right.
and there wouldn't have been an issue. But
Mhm.
because it took 3 weeks, they were really annoyed and didn't want to like engage with us for some period after that.
Fair enough.
The host was like, well, it took me that long to get the money, like the information. It's like, well, that's too long. Like 3 weeks when you're dealing with an issue resolution is way too long. And so all of this was, then we would sit down as a team and like we do a wash up, standard process, but it's like, okay, our terms need to be better.
Mm.
Our processes need to make sure we can't take bookings without all the terms signed. We need to have policies in place with how quick things need to be reported and the format they need to report it. We need to have the person booking is liable for the people staying and should it. So all things that companies you would expect should have, but there's real nuance around learning that through going through those pains. That's like the first way we then get like really deep to solution what the well, I guess what the solution is, the product solution, the process solution, the people solution, right?
Right.
But it's like we'll have something that goes wrong and it's like, okay, one thing wouldn't have fixed it, but how as a company, as an organization do we fix it? So that's like the first way we get through.
Mhm.
The second one's probably more of like an ongoing iteration where there'll be a sound bite or a feedback loop that someone will hear and say, look, we're having this situation that happens pretty regularly right now.
Mhm.
Like it's happening a few times a week.
Mhm.
Or the real phrase they start, Samantha, is it happens a lot. And my first question is, how often's a
What
lot?
is a lot? Yes.
Twice an hour,
Mm.
twice a week, twice a month. What's a lot? Like define a lot. And that's normally like a hard piece. And then now they'll start to keep a list and they know I hate spreadsheets. I like them for analysis. I hate them for to-do lists.
Yes.
But it's normally the starting point where it's like, right, to help quantify what you're telling me, document it. I
Mhm.
want to know how many times it's happened, where it's happened, and like the details around it. So that will go on for a few days, few weeks, depending how often it happens.
Mhm.
Then we'll sit down and we'll have a look at the list and say, right, is this useful information to do anything with? Yes, no. Can
Mhm.
we even do anything?
Mhm.
Normally it's like yes. So then we start to maintain it a bit more as part of a manual process. And then we get to the point where it's like, okay, we've been doing this for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. What's going to be the best way to fix this? And at that point, we then normally build the solution into the platform as part of a process. So they don't need to manually capture the information. The system captures the information, and then
Mhm.
we can build workflows off the back of it. But if we started to build the solution in the product, like, well, what are we building? And it's really easy for people to think through this is what it needs to do,
Right.
but you don't have the information to be able to calibrate with, okay, we're talking once a month, once a day, or we're talking actually it's only really these two scenarios we need to solve.
Right.
Or maybe it's seven, or maybe it's seven, but one of them is 50% of the times it happens. So it's how do we build up like a little bit of data that backs up what they're saying, and then we start engineering it into the product if it needs to.
Mm-hmm. That is just, like I said, chef's kiss, perfect. Like those are the types of things. And when you said something about spreadsheets are great for analysis, but not for to-do lists, that's just everyone should be listening hard with good ears on on that one. Really good for analysis and not for to-do lists. And without having the information, how do you make a process around it? And the other thing that really struck me, which I sincerely appreciate, is the time frame in which you're talking. We're talking weeks here. We're not talking months. We're talking let's get this moving, let's get this done. That's the kind of thing that I think has also been lacking. AI has obviously allowed that to go a lot faster, but that's the kind of timeline that's required to be able to fix these things quickly.
Exactly. And again, it comes back to quantifying what you're trying to solve.
Right.
If they start capturing the data and it is once a week, unless it's a really like significant impact when it happens, you're probably not going to be rushing to fix it. But if you were just acting on input of it happens a lot,
Mm-hmm.
once a week could be a lot to someone. But it's like, yeah, but in the grand scheme of things, of everything we're trying to fix as a company, which is a lot of things and trying to progress capabilities, that we can handle a manual process once a week because it's only once a week. Like, unfortunately, you're going to have to live with it. It's not worth fixing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas something that happens very regularly, it's like, okay, let's understand how that's happening. What's the drivers? What's the root cause? And this is why I love being in startups, because the root cause is so rarely one thing.
Right.
Like,
Right.
the amount of time there's like, well, this is going wrong. And it's like, yeah, but that's going wrong. And you think it's this, but I think it's this. And it's probably this. And we're probably all wrong. It's maybe a bit of all of them. Or maybe it's something that none of us even know.
Right.
And again, until you start capturing some of these things and you can take that data or that viewpoint to other people in the organization, you're just going on what one person typically feels, or at best they've captured, but probably in a way from their narrower viewpoint.
Their vantage
If it's
point.
sales reporting a problem, it's probably right. It's probably hurting sales, but that doesn't mean the solution that they want is the right way to get to the solution.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all
Yeah.
about just having a more structured conversation than what someone feels or what someone thinks. And that makes it sound like I don't care what people think or feel, but it's like, let's match your gut feel, your intuition, the antidotes with the data,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if the data says one thing and you feel another, you're probably right and the data's wrong.
Right.
But without the data, you can't calibrate a good solution at all. Like, you're just going off gut and instinct.
Mm-hmm. And kudos to you for your leadership on that as well, to know, like, you've been through it enough times to know we can't just make these decisions based off of gut feel, right? And I'm sure you have these scenarios too, but the amount of time where I would have given up my arm, I would have said, no, it's this. It is this. I will bet you my right arm right now that it is this. And then to have the data come back and show me, no, it wasn't even close. And I now don't have a right arm. Is amazing. Yep. So yeah, it's something to come across fairly regularly. So yeah, like I said, kudos to your leadership as well for saying, no, let's actually think through this problem as opposed to react to this problem.
Yeah. And I've lost a few arms doing that. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a common thing. Well, let's transition a little bit to your reflections, and then we'll do a few just lightning round questions before we wrap up here. But I always like to ask, especially founders who have been through this a few times, both in the VC world, bootstrap world, everything. But what would you do differently with Comfy Workers if you were starting again today? That hindsight vision is 2020 is really very helpful.
One thing I think I'm going to answer this in two ways.
Great.
And I'm not trying to sit on the fence or dodge the question.
It's okay.
But I think I really benefited from not being full-time from day one.
All right.
And I know a lot of people, it's you have something as a, let's say, a side hustle for a certain period, and then you go all in. But time in the market has been hugely valuable in this,
Mm,
because when it's really small, it's like we're bootstrapped. I don't want to take funding. I don't want investors. I don't want investment. I want to bootstrap as far as we can go. But when you have that balancing act, you you can't learn through money. You need time,
yeah.
and there is seasonality in the market. There are trends in the market that, like I always talk to the sales team on this, that unless you've had a summer season and a winter season, I can tell you what they're like,
Yes.
but you're not going to know what they're like. You're not going to feel it. And we've now had 3-4 years of time in the market that I've been able to feel and build up mental models and build up like napkin calculations and a feel of what's going on,
Okay.
which if I was on year one right now and I'd just gone hard for 6 months, I wouldn't at all. And I would be just going on what the data tells me.
Right.
And as we've just spoken, like that's not always right. So I've got like some muscle memory built up from previous ventures, but also time in this venture without having to really like scrabble and firefight and adjust really quickly. So being to like control that destiny has been a huge benefit, and probably one a lot of founders, and I know a lot in the US that are on a VC track don't really get. So
Okay.
that's been like hugely beneficial. Um, if I was to do it again, I think we've had elements where we've had technical debt based on things being good ideas that haven't played out.
Fair enough.
I think that the downside, and where this probably originates, is the downside of not being full time for all those years, is some of the feedback loops break down.
Mm-hmm.
Where when it's bootstrapped and I'm effectively with the only leadership position in the company, that feedback loop breaks down when I wasn't always here to overhear things and be able to just get a feel for some of the frontline feedback that's going on that is unstructured and put more structure around it. That's something that I definitely feel like we missed. And because of that, there were things where I think this is a great idea. The market definitely needs this. This doesn't exist, but adoption hasn't been great.
Yeah.
And I could have had conversations with 5 customers, and I'd probably come away with 5 things to do that were more valuable than what was dreamt up in some isolation. So
Absolutely.
that, like, I don't think we maximize, or I maximize that time in the market, because some of the breakdown of feedback, and that makes it sound like we communicate really poorly as a company and don't have the feedback. But it's just the I don't know, the coffee conversations, the water
Okay.
cooler ones, right? You overhear things and you just pick up things that, to be honest, you don't need to know as a founder. You don't need to know as a
Right.
CEO. You probably don't want to know half of them.
Right.
But by hearing something, you're like, okay, but if that's happening and this is happening and this is happening, like, how do we fix those? Because they're all sort of related, but in isolation, they just don't sound like important. So that's something I think that I've benefited from, but equally could have maximized more if I was doing it again.
Mm-hmm. And I know what I'm about to say is the opposite of scale, which is why processes are so important. But I truly do believe, and so everyone comes into the company with their own vantage point and they have their own things that they're responsible for. And hearing things firsthand can never, ever be replaced. Never. It can never be replaced. And so it's just a matter of figuring out a way to capture that and disseminate it in a way that makes sense for the size business that you are. But getting that information firsthand and processing it and then turning it back out into something that's meaningful for the product, the people, the team, whatever that is just
Yep,
invaluable. Invaluable.
it is. And just to piggy that back before you jump into some of the quick fire and other questions, Samantha, I always have a client story that I refer back to where I was working with a global company. I won't say the name, but it's where you found my post. Let's say that.
Okay.
And I'd been working with them in the US, in Europe, and in APAC for, well, Europe probably for 5 years, and the US for 3, and Asia probably for 6-12 months. And the VP of marketing in Asia had been telling me the same thing for probably every month for 6 months. And he just kept saying, it's different in these ways. It's different in these ways. And I was nodding and I was like, I understand. I get what you're saying. Like, it's like my other clients. I understand. And deep down, he knew I wasn't getting it. And then I was on a business trip to China and I stopped off in Singapore on the way. And within 10 minutes of walking around his office and having a conversation, just walking around, I'm like, I need to apologize. I get this. What you've been saying, I now see it. I feel it because I'm in your shoes.
Mhm.
And you can translate that message and people can hear it firsthand. Equally, sometimes you just need that context of feel and being there and going through those things. And that's one thing where, coming back to it, time in the game has really, really been beneficial.
Mhm.
But equally, if you don't maximize that, you've got some downsides. But it's one of those where how can you give context to people when you're trying to do something that they haven't done before and no other company's done before?
Right.
That's difficult.
It absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Let's transition to a few lightning round questions. And these are always the best. I love these. Just because you never know what's going to come out. You never know what anyone's going to say. So we'll see what happens here. So the first lightning round question before we wrap up is what is the worst advice, Greg, that you have ever received professionally?
Oh, I think it was less advice and more judgment,
Ooh.
in the sense of being pigeonholed, which then led me to box myself in
Mm.
and probably ignore a lot of things that would have helped me professionally for a lot of years, because it's like, no, that's not my lane. I don't need to go there. But it's like, you need to be able to go there in leadership roles, even if it's not your like natural strength. And a lot of it can be learned and taught and developed over time. But for a long time, I was like, that's fine. Just leave that to someone else. Like, that's not. So that's probably what I would say was the worst one, where someone says, look, this is what you're best at. Don't do that. Just because you're best and unique and valuable in some places doesn't mean you don't go into other ones, because a lot of
Right.
the value is in how you connect and join things and how you transfer skills and knowledge. So that was something that definitely was not great advice.
Yeah. Don't stop developing yourself in any area. Just keep going. Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
All right, next one, and this will be our last one. I'll only subject you to two of these before we wrap up. What is the most underrated business superpower?
Can you give me an example?
Absolutely. So I had Lindsay Williams on the podcast, who's the head of marketing at Shoal Technologies, and I didn't actually ask her this question, but she spoke quite a bit about empathy. So empathy being the business superpower.
Okay. As you were talking through, the one I would go to would be trust,
Mm-hmm.
which is heavily related to empathy. But from a business point of view, if you can build up a reputation where people trust you and know you for one thing, I think that becomes extremely hard for others to then erode that or take that away.
Yeah.
And okay, you can lose reputation in instances or minutes, but if everything you're doing is to build trust with your customers, and that's saying no when you can't help them, that's being honest when it's not great with them,
Mm-hmm.
that's managing expectations even when sometimes you don't want to. It's all of those things, and over time, that compounds and that compounds, and that's how you maintain business, you win it, you get referrals, because they know you're going to do the right thing for their company. And that's something I think a lot of companies overlook in the long term to win short-term value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so much more than just developing a brand, both personal and professionally. It's so much more than that. It's doing what you say you're going to do, which yes, is part of a brand, but
Yep.
it's so much more meaningful than that.
Yeah, it's a deeper brand experience
Mhm.
that builds and builds, and you add layers and layers. And it's not always telling the customer what they want to hear, but they know you're going to do what's right for them in the long run,
Right.
even if they don't want it today.
Absolutely. Yes, precisely. That's how you would build trust. That's great. I love those answers. Well, Greg, thank you so much. I appreciate, again, you being here, making the time, chatting with me about your 250,000 pound mistake, which is fabulous. Always a great time to just chat through learning and things like that. And a lot of the sound bites and just knowledge that you shared today is really beneficial. I mean, really helpful, especially for people who are feeling pretty reactionary right now in their business and they're fighting fires. I'm hoping that some of what you said here really resonates with them and maybe they slow down and start putting some of those things into spreadsheets so they can figure out what the priority is and how to fix them.
Definitely. No, love being here, Samantha, and thanks for having me.
Thanks. All right. And if this resonated with you for this has been Scale Without Chaos, please subscribe and we'll see you next week.